January 31, 1945. Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. Major Frank McCoy's boots crunched against the coral gravel as he approached the abandoned bomber. The Mitsubishi G4M sat motionless on the tarmac, its cylindrical fuselage gleaming in the tropical afternoon light. Tail number 763-12 was clearly visible on the vertical stabilizer, painted in stark Japanese characters that seemed incongruous against the American-controlled airfield. Quick pause before we continue. If you love uncovering the real battles, secret tactics, and shocking reversals that shaped history, make sure to subscribe and like this video. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how these war stories reach history fans all over the world. Every week we bring you another untold story of courage, innovation, and survival. Alright, let's get back to the front lines. McCoy stopped 20 meters away and raised his camera. The aircraft before him looked untouched by war. No shattered canopy glass. No torn metal skin. No fire-blackened engine nacelles. No collapsed landing gear. The distinctive rounded fuselage, the feature that had earned it the Allied nickname Betty, sat perfectly level on its tricycle undercarriage, as if waiting for its crew to return. In 4 years of Pacific combat, this was the first completely intact Betty the Allies had captured. McCoy circled slowly, photographing from every angle. The bomber measured nearly 20 meters from nose to tail. Its wings spanned 25 meters tip to tip, the broad chord giving the aircraft its characteristic silhouette that American pilots had learned to recognize at extreme distances. The twin 14-cylinder Mitsubishi Kase radial engines, each producing 1,500 horsepower, remained mounted in their nacelles, propeller blades motionless in the still air. He moved closer, documenting details. The glass nose cone sat unshattered, its bombardier position clearly visible through the transparent panels. The dorsal gun turret showed no battle damage. The tail gun position appeared intact. Even the navigation lights on the wingtips remained unbroken. This wasn't a crashed aircraft salvaged from wreckage. This wasn't a bomber shot down and recovered from shallow water. This wasn't a machine reconstructed from scattered components found across a mountainside. This was an operational bomber, abandoned by its crew during the American advance on Manila, left behind as Japanese forces retreated northward into the mountains. The aircraft sat on American-held territory now, a complete engineering specimen frozen in time. McCoy had commanded the Technical Air Intelligence Unit, Southwest Pacific, since early 1943. His teams had examined dozens of Japanese aircraft across New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and now the Philippines. Zeros pulled from jungle crash sites, their lightweight construction crumpled by impact. Valves recovered from harbors, their dive brakes twisted by water damage. Oscars salvaged from forward airstrips, their structures burned and incomplete. Always wrecked. Always damaged. Always requiring reconstruction and educated guesswork to understand the original design intent. But this Betty was different. Every system remained intact. Every panel accessible. Every design decision laid bare for examination without the distortions of combat damage or crash trauma. This was the opportunity his unit had been waiting for, a chance to understand Japanese bomber doctrine not through fragmentary evidence, but through direct inspection of a complete, pristine example. McCoy approached the wing route where rectangular maintenance hatches provided access to the interior structure. Standard procedure for examining captured aircraft. Photograph the exterior completely, then begin systematic internal documentation. Engines first, then fuel systems, then armament, then flight controls. Every component measured, photographed, cataloged. He set down his camera bag and opened the access panel. The hatch swung outward smoothly, its hinges still functional. McCoy directed his flashlight into the wing cavity, expecting to see the standard labyrinth of fuel tanks, structural spars, control cables, and hydraulic lines that characterized military aircraft design. What he saw instead made him freeze. The wing interior was almost empty. Fuel tanks occupied nearly the entire space, their aluminum surfaces gleaming in the flashlight beam.
No protective coatings. No rubber compound.
No fire suppression bottles.
No armor plating.
Just bare metal. Thin aluminum sheet, perhaps 2 millimeters thick, separating thousands of liters of high-octane aviation gasoline from the outside world. McCoy climbed further inside, his disbelief growing with each inspection. Main fuel tanks, unprotected. Auxiliary tanks, unprotected. Reserve tanks, unprotected. Every fuel cell in the aircraft showed the same design philosophy: maximum capacity, minimum weight, zero protection. He ran his hand along the interior surface. The metal was cold, smooth, impossibly thin. A single tracer round would puncture it easily. A shell fragment would tear it open. Even sustained machine gun fire from extreme range would penetrate this aluminum skin and ignite the fuel vapor inside. This cannot be their standard design. No Air Force would build bombers this way. Not deliberately. Not as policy. Protection for fuel systems was foundational to bomber design. Every nation understood that. The Americans had self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb multiple hits. The British used rubber compounds that swelled when punctured, closing bullet holes automatically. Even the Germans, desperate for strategic materials by 1943, still protected their bomber fuel systems. But the evidence before him was undeniable. McCoy backed out of the wing cavity and moved to the opposite wing. Same design. Same unprotected tanks. Same thin aluminum skin. He checked the fuselage fuel cells. Identical construction. Every fuel tank in the aircraft, every tank that would carry the gasoline needed for the Betty's legendary range, was completely exposed to enemy fire. This wasn't a maintenance shortcut. This wasn't wartime material shortage forcing compromises. This wasn't emergency field modification or battle damage repair. This was the original design. And with that realization, McCoy understood why American pilots had been reporting Betty bombers exploding so violently when hit. Why loss rates had been so catastrophic once Allied fighters reached strength. Why Japanese bomber crews died in such overwhelming numbers during the Guadalcanal campaign. Japan had built its most important bomber to fly far, not to fly home. McCoy's flashlight beam swept across the wing's interior cavity, illuminating what should have been a complex maze of protective systems. Instead, he found only empty space and bare metal. The fuel tanks dominated the entire wing structure, massive aluminum containers stretching from the fuselage attachment point nearly to the wingtip. Their surfaces gleamed dully in the flashlight beam, unmarked by any protective coating.
No rubber compound. No sealant layer.
No fire retardant paint. Just raw aluminum sheet metal, perhaps 2 millimeters thick, formed into fuel cells that held thousands of liters of high-octane aviation gasoline. McCoy climbed deeper into the wing cavity, his trained eye cataloging every absent system. No self-sealing rubber compound. American bombers used layers of vulcanized rubber that swelled when punctured by bullets, automatically closing holes and preventing fuel loss. The Betty had nothing. A single bullet hole would drain fuel continuously until the tank emptied or the aircraft exploded. No CO2 fire suppression system. American designs included bottles of carbon dioxide that could flood fuel tank spaces, displacing oxygen and smothering fires before they spread. The Betty's wings contained no such equipment. Once ignited, fuel fires would burn uncontrolled until the aircraft disintegrated. No armor plating around critical areas. American bombers protected fuel lines, pumps, and connections with steel plate that could deflect small arms fire. The Betty's fuel system components sat exposed, vulnerable to even glancing hits.
No foam baffles.
American tanks used reticulated foam that prevented fuel from sloshing violently during maneuvers and reduced the explosive vapor space above the liquid fuel. The Betty's tanks were open cavities where fuel vapor could accumulate freely, creating massive explosive potential. The engineering was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its implications. McCoy moved to the opposite wing. Identical construction. Same unprotected tanks. Same thin aluminum skin. He returned to the fuselage and located the access panels for the fuselage fuel cells. Same design philosophy throughout. Every fuel tank in the entire aircraft showed the same ruthless weight-saving measures. He pulled out his measuring tape and notebook, documenting dimensions with mechanical precision even as his mind raced through the implications. The main wing tanks measured approximately 4 meters long, 1 meter wide, half a meter deep. Total fuel capacity appeared to exceed 4,000 liters, extraordinary for an aircraft of this size, explaining the Betty's legendary range. But every liter sat unprotected. McCoy calculated quickly. Total weight saved by eliminating protection systems, perhaps 400 to 500 kilograms. That weight translated directly into additional fuel capacity or extended range. The designers had made their choice explicit. Range mattered more than survivability. He photographed the bare tank surfaces from multiple angles, the camera's shutter clicking in the confined space. These images would need to reach Washington immediately. Every assumption about Japanese aviation doctrine, about the trade-offs enemy designers were willing to accept, about the value imperial forces placed on crew survival, all of it would need revision. The evidence was irrefutable. Japan had designed its primary bomber to be a flying bomb, one that enemy gunfire would detonate with terrifying efficiency. McCoy climbed out of the wing cavity and stood beside the aircraft, looking at its sleek exterior with new understanding. The Betty was brilliant and suicidal. The question was whether Japanese designers had understood the cost their aircrews would pay for that brilliance. I'll write each chapter following your outlines, maintaining the established tone and staying within the 300-word limit for each. McCoy's preliminary report reached Allied Air Technical Intelligence Headquarters within 48 hours. By the end of the week, analysts across the Pacific Theater were studying his photographs and measurements. The mathematics were undeniable. Weight saved by eliminating fuel tank protection, approximately 450 kilograms. Additional fuel capacity gained, roughly 600 liters. Extended range, an additional 800 kilometers under optimal conditions. The Betty could strike targets 2,600 kilometers from its base and return, a capability unmatched by any Allied bomber in 1941. That range had given Japan strategic reach across the entire Pacific theater during the war's opening phase. But the cost was written in fire across 3 years of combat reports. Lieutenant Commander James Thatch studied McCoy's findings at his desk in Pearl Harbor. He'd fought Bettys over Guadalcanal, watched them explode from single bursts of .50 caliber fire, seen entire formations disintegrate under fighter attack.
Now he understood why.
They traded crew survival for operational range, he wrote in his tactical analysis. Every decision, fuel tank placement, absence of protection, minimal structural redundancy, prioritized distance over defense. The result is an aircraft optimized for offensive operations in an environment without fighter opposition. Other analysts reached similar conclusions. The Betty embodied a design philosophy alien to Western military thinking, accept catastrophic vulnerability in exchange for extreme performance. Assume air superiority. Assume short engagement windows. Assume the war would be decided before sustained attrition became relevant. Japan had built a first-strike weapon for a short war. Instead, they faced a 4-year campaign of industrial attrition where every design compromise became fatal, where every weight-saving measure cost lives, where the bomber crews flew knowing their aircraft would ignite from hits that American bombers would shrug off. The Betty was brilliant engineering answering the wrong question. December 8, 1941, 12:35 p.m. Clark Field, Philippines. Lieutenant James Harrington heard them before he saw them, a distant droning that built into thunder as 82 bombers approached from the north. He stood beside his P-40 Warhawk, frozen by the sheer scale of the formation darkening the sky. They flew at 20,000 feet, beyond the reach of American anti-aircraft guns, their tight V formations holding perfect discipline. The first wave, 27 bombers, opened their bomb bays simultaneously. 636 bombs fell across Clark Field's runways and facilities. The ground erupted. Explosions marched across the tarmac in geometric patterns, each detonation sending debris and shrapnel scything through parked aircraft. Harrington dove into a bomb shelter as the concussion waves rolled over the field, the air itself becoming violent. Then the Zeros came. Japanese fighters swept in at treetop level, their machine guns tearing through every aircraft that survived the bombing. B-17 Flying Fortresses, massive four-engine bombers that represented American air power in the Pacific, exploded or burned where they sat. P-40 fighters were reduced to twisted metal and burning fuel. Harrington watched through the shelter's opening, helpless. 17 B-17s had been on the field that morning. 12 were destroyed outright, the others damaged beyond immediate repair. Nearly every P-40 was gone. 45 minutes. That's all it took to eliminate American air power in the Philippines. The Betty bombers themselves departed untouched, their formations reforming as they turned northward toward Formosa. The few American fighters that managed to scramble arrived too late, finding only empty sky and smoke rising from their devastated base. The Japanese had struck from bases 460 miles away, demonstrating a reach that no American bomber could match in December 1941. And they had done it without losing a single aircraft to American fighters. The unprotected fuel tanks didn't matter when there were no enemies to shoot at them. December 10, 1941, 12:20 p.m. South China Sea. Captain John Leach stood on HMS Prince of Wales's bridge, watching the Japanese bomber formation approach from the north. 26 G4M Bettys joined by older G3M models, their distinctive silhouettes unmistakable against the tropical sky. Force C had no air cover. The promised fighter protection from Singapore had never arrived. The torpedo runs began with devastating precision. Betty bombers dropped to low altitude, each carrying an 840-kilogram Type 91 aerial torpedo designed specifically for shallow water operations. They approached in coordinated waves, timing their attacks to overwhelm the capital ship's defensive fire. Prince of Wales, 43,000 tons of the newest British naval power, armed with 10 14-inch guns and the most modern fire control systems in the Royal Navy, took the first torpedo hit amidships. The underwater explosion tore a massive hole in the hull. Then another hit. And another. The battleship's anti-aircraft guns blazed continuously, claiming several Japanese aircraft. But the coordinated torpedo runs kept coming, exploiting gaps in the defensive fire, attacking from multiple angles simultaneously. 6 torpedoes found Prince of Wales. The cumulative damage overwhelmed every damage control measure. Flooding spread through multiple compartments. The battleship listed severely, its main guns now unable to track targets effectively. 1,300 meters away, HMS Repulse, a World War I battle cruiser modernized in the 1930s, fought its own desperate battle. For torpedoes struck home despite frantic maneuvering. The ship's 15-inch guns were useless against aircraft. Only anti-aircraft fire could save her. It wasn't enough. Prince of Wales capsized at 1:20 p.m. Repulse followed 13 minutes later. 841 British sailors died. The engagement lasted less than 2 hours from first contact to final sinking. For the first time in naval history, capital ships actively defending themselves had been sunk solely by air power in the open sea. The Betty had achieved what naval theorists had debated for decades. Through the first 6 months of 1942, Betty bombers struck across distances that defied Allied understanding of air warfare. They attacked Darwin, Australia from bases 1,500 miles away, demonstrating reach that exceeded any Allied bomber's capability. American B-17s could manage perhaps 2,000 miles under optimal conditions, but only with reduced bomb loads and in ideal weather. The Betty routinely operated at extreme range while carrying full torpedo or bomb loads. They hit Port Moresby from airfields across New Guinea's mountain ranges, maintaining constant pressure on Allied positions throughout the Southwest Pacific. Every attempt to establish forward air bases brought immediate Japanese response, Betty bombers appearing overhead with regularity that suggested unlimited operational flexibility. They struck Guadalcanal from Rabaul, a distance exceeding 600 miles each way. The daily raids became known as Tojo time, Japanese bombers arriving with clockwork precision, delivering their ordnance, and disappearing back across the slot before Allied fighters could intercept effectively. The strategic asymmetry was complete. Japanese forces could attack Allied positions at will while Allied bombers lacked the range to strike back at Japanese bases. American fighters stationed at forward airfields couldn't intercept Betty formations departing from distant bases. Allied commanders found themselves defending everywhere while unable to retaliate effectively anywhere. The Betty's range gave Japan the initiative. They chose when to attack, where to concentrate force, which targets to prioritize. Allied forces remained reactive, responding to threats rather than projecting power. This advantage persisted through mid-1942, with Betty bombers participating in virtually every major Japanese operation across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. They became the symbol of Japanese air power's reach, the aircraft that could strike anywhere, anytime, with impunity. But the advantage depended entirely on one condition remaining constant: limited Allied fighter opposition. That condition was about to change. August 8, 1942, 1:15 p.m. Over Savo Island, 23 G-4M bombers from the 4th Air Group flew in perfect formation toward Guadalcanal, their bomb bays loaded for another strike against the newly established American positions. The 600-mile flight from Rabaul had been routine, the same route flown dozens of times since American forces landed 6 days earlier. Commander Tadashi Nakajima led the formation, confident in their altitude and defensive firepower. Betty bombers had dominated these skies for 8 months. American fighters had proven unable to intercept formations departing from Rabaul's distant bases. That assumption died at 1:20 p.m. Marine F-4F Wildcats from Henderson Field climbed to meet them, 19 fighters positioned perfectly for interception. The Americans had radar now, early warning that eliminated surprise. They had forward airfields that cut interception time. They had tactical doctrine refined through months of combat. The Wildcats struck from above and ahead, diving through the bomber formation with .50 caliber guns blazing. The standard Betty defensive tactics, tight formation, concentrated defensive fire, proved inadequate against the coordinated American attack. The first Betty exploded immediately, a single burst igniting its unprotected fuel tanks. The bomber disintegrated in a massive fireball that scattered burning debris across 2,000 feet of sky. Then another exploded. And another. Nakajima watched in horror as his formation came apart. Bettys didn't just burn when hit. They erupted violently, their unprotected fuel tanks detonating from minimal damage. Aircraft that took only glancing hits exploded as catastrophically as those receiving sustained fire. The Wildcats made multiple passes, their tactics brutally effective. Aim for the wings. Hit the fuel tanks. Watch the targets explode. When the engagement ended, 18 of the 23 Betty bombers had been shot down. Not damaged. Not forced to turn back. Destroyed. The 5 survivors limped back to Rabaul, their crews traumatized by losses that exceeded anything experienced in 8 months of combat. The Betty's vulnerability had been catastrophically exposed. The combat reports from American fighter pilots all described the same phenomenon. Hit one in the wing root. It just exploded. Didn't catch fire and burn. Exploded like a bomb going off. Lieutenant Robert Gaylor, VMF 224, fired a 2-second burst into the fuselage. The Betty disintegrated in a massive fireball. I had to brake hard to avoid the debris. Captain Marion Carl, VMF 223. We called them flying Zippos. One good burst anywhere near the wings, and they'd light up like matches. Lieutenant James Sweat, VMF, 221. The nickname spread quickly through American fighter squadrons, flying cigarette lighters. One tracer round through the wing was often sufficient. The unprotected fuel tanks ignited instantly, fuel vapor exploding with force that tore aircraft apart in midair. American pilots learned to aim for the wings rather than the fuselage. A direct hit on the fuel tanks guaranteed destruction. Even near misses could puncture the thin aluminum skin, releasing fuel that ignited from engine heat or tracer rounds passing nearby. The Betty's defensive armament couldn't compensate. The 20mm tail cannon had limited traverse. The dorsal turret's 7.7mm machine guns lacked stopping power against American fighters attacking at high speed. The beam guns were manually aimed, ineffective against coordinated attacks from multiple angles. Betty formations tried every defensive tactic. Tighter formations to concentrate firewall. Altitude variations to complicate attacks. Fighter escorts when available. Nothing worked consistently. American fighters had learned the Betty's fatal weakness, and they exploited it ruthlessly. Aim for the wings. Hit the fuel tanks. Watch the target explode. By late 1942, Betty crews understood their odds. Every mission over contested airspace was suicide. The unprotected fuel tanks that gave their aircraft extraordinary range now made every flight a calculation of probability. Not whether they would be hit,
but when.
And whether the hit would kill them instantly or give them seconds to realize they were already dead. The statistics told the story in numbers too devastating to ignore. Rebel. August 1942, 23 Bettys dispatched, 18 destroyed, 78% loss rate. Bin. October 1942, 17 Bettys dispatched, 12 destroyed, 71% loss rate. WWII. August 1943, 20 Bettys dispatched, 16 destroyed, 80% loss rate. Squadron after squadron vanished in single missions. Experienced crews died faster than training programs could replace them. Aircraft production couldn't keep pace with losses. The Betty's operational strength across the Pacific Theater declined month by month despite continued production. Japanese commanders faced impossible mathematics. Maintaining pressure on Allied positions required constant bombing operations. But those operations consumed aircraft and crews at rates that guaranteed eventual collapse. At Rabaul, the 4th Air Group had fielded 72 operational Bettys in June 1942. By December, fewer than 20 remained serviceable. Replacement aircraft arrived regularly, but replacement crews, trained crews with combat experience, could not be produced fast enough. The veteran pilots who survived developed fatalistic attitudes. They flew because orders demanded it, knowing each mission reduced their survival probability. Some kept detailed calculations: missions flown, aircraft lost, crews killed, statistical likelihood of death within the next 10 sorties. The mathematics were relentless. Flying twice weekly meant perhaps 3 months before death became statistically certain. Flying daily shortened that window to weeks. Ground crews watched bombers depart and counted those that returned. The ratios worsened steadily. 3 returned from 5. 2 from 5. 1 from 5. None from 5. By mid-1943, Betty units operated at fractions of authorized strength. Squadrons existed on paper with full complements, but fielded perhaps 6 operational aircraft. Groups authorized for 72 bombers flew missions with 20. The Betty's design philosophy, accept vulnerability for range, had worked brilliantly when Allied fighter opposition remained limited. Now that opposition had grown overwhelming, and the philosophy was killing crews faster than Japan could train replacements. The bomber that had dominated the Pacific's first year was dying squadron by squadron, mission by mission, aircraft by aircraft. February 1945. Allied Air Technical Intelligence, Brisbane, Australia. The complete Betty from Clark Field had been disassembled with surgical precision. Every component measured, weighed, photographed, analyzed. Engineers spread the findings across tables and walls, a complete engineering autopsy of Japanese bomber design philosophy. The fuel system documentation told the story most clearly. Total fuel capacity, 4,470 liters distributed across multiple tanks, main wing tanks, auxiliary wing tanks, fuselage tanks, and optional long-range tanks. Maximum internal fuel load, 4,080 kilograms. Weight of protection systems, 0 kilograms. Weight savings, estimated 450 to 500 kilograms compared to equivalent American bomber protection. Range gained, approximately 800 kilometers additional operational radius. The trade-off was explicit in every design decision. Fuel tank walls measured 1.8 to 2.2 millimeters, the absolute minimum thickness to maintain structural integrity. No self-sealing compound added weight or reduced capacity. No CO2 systems consumed space. No armor plating protected critical areas. Engineers calculated the weight budget obsessively. Every kilogram saved translated to additional fuel, additional range, additional strategic reach. The designers had prioritized performance with ruthless efficiency. American analysts compared the Betty's fuel system to equivalent U.S. bombers. The B-25 Mitchell carried approximately 2,600 liters with full protection systems. The B-26 Marauder held 2,400 liters, also fully protected. Both aircraft accepted reduced range in exchange for crew survivability. The Betty carried nearly double the fuel, completely unprotected. The structural analysis revealed similar philosophy throughout. Minimal redundancy in load-bearing members. Thin aluminum skin optimized for weight rather than durability. Simplified systems that reduced maintenance requirements, but eliminated backup capabilities. Even the defensive armament reflected the same thinking. The 20mm tail cannon and machine guns provided minimal protection compared to American bombers' multiple turrets, but saved hundreds of kilograms. Every system prioritized offensive capability over defensive survival. The engineers concluded their assessment with clinical precision. The G4M design represents a coherent philosophy trading survivability for performance. The aircraft achieves exceptional range through systematic elimination of protective systems. The result is optimized for offensive operations in permissive environments, but catastrophically vulnerable to fighter opposition. Translation: brilliant bomber for a war Japan didn't fight. The design specifications for the G4M had been issued in 1937, when the context for Japanese bomber requirements seemed clear. Assumption 1. The war would be short. Japanese military planning assumed decisive campaigns lasting months, not years. Quick strikes, rapid victories, negotiated settlements before enemy industrial capacity could mobilize. A bomber designed for sustained attrition warfare was unnecessary. Offensive reach mattered more than long-term survivability. Assumption 2. Air superiority would persist. In 1937, Japanese fighters outclassed everything in the Pacific theater. The Zero's combat debut was still 3 years away, but Japanese confidence in fighter superiority was absolute. Bombers would operate under protective fighter cover or strike targets where enemy fighters remained scarce. Sustained bomber versus fighter combat seemed unlikely. Assumption 3. Enemy response would be slow. Japan assumed that China would lack modern fighters, that Western colonial forces in Southeast Asia would be undermanned and ill-equipped, that America's focus on Europe would delay Pacific reinforcement. The window for bomber operations without serious opposition would last long enough to achieve strategic objectives. Assumption 4. Range guaranteed initiative. The ability to strike from distant bases, to project power across vast ocean expanses, to attack targets beyond enemy retaliation range. This capability would determine the war's outcome. A bomber that could hit Pearl Harbor from Japanese territory, strike the Philippines from Formosa, Attack Darwin from occupied Indonesia would dictate the tempo of operations. Every assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The war lasted for years, not months. American fighter production reached thousands per month. Allied air strength grew overwhelming. The Betty's range advantage disappeared as Allied forces established forward bases across recaptured territory. But the bomber's design was frozen in 1937 assumptions. No mid-war modification could add fuel tank protection without reducing range. No retrofit could install adequate armor without destroying performance. The aircraft's fundamental trade-offs couldn't be reversed. The Betty entered service in 1941 as an elegant answer to 1937 questions. By 1943, those questions were obsolete, but thousands of crews still flew the answers into combat and died. By late 1944, the Betty had become a case study in design philosophy gone wrong, taught to American aviation engineers as an example of how strategic assumptions could doom an otherwise capable aircraft. The technical assessment was damning. The G4M achieved its operational range through systematic sacrifice of crew protection. This design philosophy assumed operational conditions, air superiority, limited interception, short war duration, that failed to materialize. The result was an aircraft optimized for a conflict that did not occur. But the human cost transcended engineering analysis. Approximately 2,400 G4M bombers were produced between 1940 and 1945. Operational loss rates varied by period and theater, but averaged between 40 to 60% in contested environments after mid-1942. Thousands of aircrew died in aircraft that ignited from damage American bombers would survive routinely. The Betty's losses weren't random attrition. They were predictable consequences of design choices made years earlier. Engineers in 1937 had decided crew survival was negotiable. Crews in 1943 paid that price in fire. Allied intelligence analyzed capture documents showing Japanese awareness of the problem. Field modifications were attempted: external armor panels, fuel tank foam inserts, additional fire extinguishers. None proved effective. The protection systems required were too heavy, too complex, too fundamental to retrofit onto existing airframes. Production of improved variants, the G4M2 and G4M3, attempted to address vulnerabilities, but the basic design philosophy remained unchanged. Range still took priority over protection. Weight savings still trumped crew survival. The Betty became a symbol of institutional failure, how assumptions unchallenged during peacetime design became death sentences during wartime operations. How engineering decisions made in conference rooms determined who lived and died in combat. How valuing performance over people created aircraft that won early battles but lost the war. American engineers studied the Betty not to copy its design, but to avoid its philosophy. Never sacrifice crew protection for performance. Never assume operational conditions will remain favorable. Never design for the war you want rather than the war you'll fight. The Betty had been brilliant for a war that never happened. For the war that did happen, it was a death trap that killed thousands of men who trusted their engineers to value their lives. April 18, 1943.
7:20 a.m.
Over Bougainville Island. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's transport, a Betty bomber configured for VIP transport, flew at 4,500 feet, approaching Balele Airfield for an inspection tour. The aircraft carried Japan's most important military leader, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the strategic genius whose planning had shaped the Pacific War's opening phase. 16 American P-38 Lightning fighters had departed Henderson Field 70 minutes earlier on a mission so secret only the pilots and senior commanders knew its objective. They flew low over the ocean, avoiding Japanese radar, timing their arrival with precision. The interception occurred exactly as planned. Captain Thomas Lamphere's P-38 caught the first Betty from behind and below. His .50 caliber guns and 20mm cannon raked the bomber's right wing, stitching holes through the thin aluminum skin. The fuel tanks ignited instantly. The Betty didn't burn gradually, it exploded. The right wing disintegrated in a massive fireball, structural failure following immediately. The bomber rolled violently right, trailing flame and debris, before plunging into the jungle below. There were no survivors. Yamamoto died instantly, killed by the same design philosophy he had approved years earlier. The unprotected fuel tanks that gave Betty bombers their extraordinary range had just killed Japan's most irreplaceable military leader. The loss devastated Japanese morale. Yamamoto's strategic genius, his understanding of American industrial capacity, his awareness that Japan needed quick victory, all gone in an instant because one wing hit was sufficient to doom any Betty. American intelligence had known Yamamoto's travel schedule through decoded Japanese communications. They had planned the interception with mathematical precision. They had executed the ambush perfectly. But the kill itself required only standard procedure. Aim for the wings, hit the fuel tanks, watch the target explode. The same vulnerability that killed ordinary bomber crews killed admirals identically. The Betty made no distinction between the expendable and the irreplaceable. March 21, 1945.
11:30 a.m.
Southwest of Kyushu. 18 Betty bombers departed Japanese airfields carrying Oka rocket-powered suicide bombs beneath their fuselages. Each Oka weighed 2,140 kilograms, a massive load that reduced the already vulnerable Bettys to wallowing targets struggling to maintain formation. The mission plan was desperate. Fly within 15 kilometers of American naval forces, release the Oka pilots, who would then rocket toward enemy ships at 650 kilometers per hour. The Bettys would serve as launch platforms for Japan's newest kamikaze weapon. They never got close. American radar detected the formation at extreme range. CAP fighters, Hellcats and Corsairs, vectored to intercept. The Americans had numbers, altitude advantage, and tactical surprise. The engagement was massacre. The Bettys, weighed down by Oka bombs, couldn't maneuver effectively. Their unprotected fuel tanks made every hit potentially fatal. American pilots exploited both vulnerabilities ruthlessly. The first Betty exploded at 11:52 a.m., its fuel tanks igniting from a brief burst. The Oka bombs separated and tumbled into the ocean. Then another Betty exploded. And another. Some Bettys jettisoned their Oka bombs trying to escape, but the weight reduction came too late. American fighters pursued remorselessly, their doctrine now refined through years of practice. Aim for the wings, hit the fuel tanks, confirm the explosion. The slaughter lasted 23 minutes. All 18 Betty bombers were destroyed. Every Oka pilot died before releasing their weapons. Every Betty crewman perished. 0 American ships were threatened. The mission accomplished nothing except adding another 55 deaths to the Betty's casualty ledger. Back at Japanese bases, ground crews waited for aircraft that would never return. The mathematics were inescapable. The Betty's vulnerability had progressed beyond tactical liability to strategic impossibility. Even suicide missions, missions where crew survival was explicitly irrelevant, failed because the aircraft couldn't survive long enough to deliver their weapons. The bomber designed for long-range strike operations couldn't reach targets anymore. It could only reach graves. By early 1945, Betty units existed as organizational ghosts, squadrons with names and histories, but no operational strength. The 4th Air Group, which once fielded 72 bombers, operated with 6. The 1st Air Group, veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, had 3 serviceable aircraft. The 751st Air Group, stationed at Rabaul, had been effectively destroyed, its surviving aircraft evacuated, its crews dispersed or dead. Production continued, but replacement aircraft died as quickly as they arrived. New crews, poorly trained by 1945 standards, lacking the veteran expertise that characterized early war units, died on their first missions. The institutional knowledge accumulated through 3 years of combat evaporated as experienced crews perished faster than lessons could be transmitted. American fighter strength had become overwhelming. Hellcats, Corsairs, P-38s, and P-51s operated with total air superiority across most of the Pacific theater. Betty formations attempting daylight operations encountered fighter opposition that guaranteed catastrophic losses. Night operations offered no sanctuary. American night fighters equipped with radar-hunted Bettys in darkness that once provided cover. The unprotected fuel tanks burned just as brightly at midnight as at noon. The strategic collapse was complete. Japan's air power, which had dominated the Pacific's first year, had been systematically destroyed. The Betty, once the symbol of Japanese aerial reach, now symbolized futility. Crews flew because orders demanded it, but everyone understood the mathematics. Every mission was suicide. Every takeoff likely their last. Ground crews painted white identification stripes on some Bettys, aircraft designated for special transport missions, supposedly immune from attack. But most Bettys retained their camouflage paint, serving combat roles they could no longer survive. By war's end, the Betty's operational history had become a statistical study in unsustainable attrition. Thousands of aircraft produced, thousands of crew members trained, thousands of sorties flown, and thousands dead, killed by design choices made before the war even began. August 19, 1945. Aishima Airfield, Okinawa. Two Mitsubishi G-4M bombers approached the American-held airfield painted brilliant white with green crosses, marking their nationality. The aircraft carried Japan's surrender delegation, 16 officials traveling to receive instructions for the formal capitulation ceremony. The same bombers that opened the Pacific War now closed it. The symbolism was inescapable. Betty bombers that had struck Pearl Harbor's aftermath, sunk British capital ships, terrorized Allied positions across Southeast Asia, now carried diplomats to arrange Japan's surrender. The transformation from weapon to white flag was complete. American fighters escorted the white-painted Bettys carefully, their presence both protective and proprietary. These bombers no longer threatened anyone. Their unprotected fuel tanks, once symbols of Japanese offensive philosophy, now simply carried diplomatic passengers toward humiliation. The delegation landed safely. The Betty shut down their engines for the last time in what had been hostile territory. Japanese officials emerged from aircraft that had become obsolete long before Japan's defeat became inevitable. Over the following weeks, other white-painted Bettys flew similar missions: transport duties, evacuation flights, ceremonial functions. The bomber designed for long-range offensive strike had been reduced to flying taxi service for a defeated nation. The white paint couldn't erase what these aircraft represented. Every Betty carried history written in fire: the thousands of crews who died in unprotected fuel tanks, the design philosophy that valued range over life, the strategic assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong. On September 2, 1945, Japan signed surrender documents aboard USS Missouri. Betty bombers painted white sat at airfields across occupied territory, grounded permanently. Their operational history concluded. The aircraft that had opened the war carrying torpedoes closed it carrying surrender delegates. The Betty's journey mirrored Japan's entire Pacific campaign: early dominance, fatal miscalculation, catastrophic collapse, ultimate defeat. Post-war aviation analysis treated the Betty as both technical achievement and cautionary tale. The aircraft's engineering was undeniably brilliant. Achieving 2,600-kilometer operational range in 1941 represented cutting-edge capability. The structural efficiency, the aerodynamic refinement, the engine integration, all demonstrated exceptional design sophistication. But the engineering served flawed strategic assumptions. The G-4M was a magnificent bomber for a war that Japan never fought, concluded the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. It assumed short campaigns, air superiority, and limited opposition. When those conditions failed to materialize, The aircraft's fundamental design philosophy became fatal to its crews. Allied engineers identified the specific miscalculation. Japan optimized for maximum capability rather than acceptable capability with protection. American and British bombers accepted reduced range in exchange for crew survivability. The Betty rejected that trade-off, assuming operational conditions would remain permissive indefinitely. The assumption failed catastrophically. German aviation engineers studied captured Betty documentation, reaching similar conclusions. The Luftwaffe's own experience with unprotected fuel tanks, particularly in early Bf 110 variants, had taught identical lessons. Protection couldn't be negotiated away regardless of performance gains. The Betty's legacy influenced post-war bomber design universally. Every major aviation power concluded that crew protection was non-negotiable. Self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating, redundant systems, fire suppression. These became mandatory features regardless of weight penalties. No post-war bomber repeated the Betty's philosophy. The aircraft had been brilliant for the wrong war, optimized for offensive operations in permissive environments, catastrophically vulnerable in contested airspace, strategically obsolete once initial assumptions collapsed. Historians studying the Pacific War frequently cited the Betty as embodying Japan's larger strategic failure, planning for short, decisive conflict while lacking resources for sustained industrial warfare. The bomber's unprotected fuel tanks became metaphor, spectacular capability built on unsustainable assumptions, brilliant until challenged, fatal once tested. Major Frank McCoy returned to Clark Air Base in late 1945, walking past abandoned Japanese aircraft scattered across the airfield. The Betty he'd examined in January sat deteriorating in tropical weather, its pristine condition degraded by months of neglect. He climbed inside one final time, his flashlight illuminating the still unprotected fuel tanks. The engineering remained impressive, elegant solutions to complex problems, sophisticated optimization, mathematical precision. But the human cost transcended engineering achievement. Approximately 2,400 G-4M bombers produced. Conservative estimates suggested 15,000 crew members trained to fly them. Loss rates in contested environments averaged 50% per year after mid-1942. The mathematics yielded thousands dead, exact numbers lost to incomplete Japanese records, but undeniably catastrophic. Those men died in aircraft that prioritized performance over their survival. They flew knowing their fuel tanks offered zero protection, that single hits could prove instantly fatal, that their survival probability decreased with every mission. They flew anyway because duty demanded it and institutional philosophy had decided their lives were acceptable costs for operational range. McCoy thought about the design decisions made in 1937. Engineers in conference rooms, calculating weight budgets, prioritizing range, accepting vulnerability as necessary trade-off. Did they consider the human cost? Did they calculate how many crews would burn alive in their optimized fuel tanks? Or did they simply assume the war would be short, enemy fighters scarce, their aircraft untouchable? The Betty story wasn't just about engineering miscalculation. It was about what happened when institutions valued performance over people, when strategic assumptions went unchallenged, when designers made choices for others who would pay the consequences. Every unprotected fuel tank represented a decision. Range mattered more than the men who flew the missions. Japan's defeat proved that decision wrong. But the thousands who died in Betty bombers paid that price years before the verdict became obvious. McCoy climbed down from the aircraft and walked away, leaving the Betty to rust under Philippine skies, a monument to brilliance serving the wrong questions, achieving the wrong answers, and costing lives that could never be recalculated or redeemed.